On the afternoon of December 8, 2005, a Southwest Airlines Boeing 737 took off from Baltimore behind schedule due to bad weather at the destination airport. Chicago was in the grip of a severe winter storm. Snow had begun falling early in the day, accumulating over 8 inches. Visibility was reduced to less than half a mile, with freezing fog and east winds reaching up to 11 knots. On board were more than 100 people hoping to complete a day marked by delays and harsh weather conditions. December 8, 2005, Baltimore Washington International Airport, USA. It's a few minutes past 5 p.m., and here, Flight 1248 is waiting for clearance to depart for Chicago. This flight was scheduled to leave at 3:50 p.m., but weather conditions in Chicago are unfavorable, so for now, they must wait until they improve. Southwest Airlines Flight 1248 was part of a multi-leg service. It departed from Baltimore Washington International Airport, with a stop in Chicago Midway, continuing on to Salt Lake City and ending in Las Vegas. The initial route crossed the eastern U.S., heading to an urban airport particularly challenging due to its short runways and residential surroundings. The aircraft for Flight 1248 was a Boeing 737-7H4, registration N471WN, barely a year old. It had accumulated about 5,273 flight hours over 2,901 cycles. Powered by two CFM56-7B24 engines, it was equipped with the most modern systems available. It had a maximum capacity of 137 passengers in a single economy class, Southwest's typical configuration for this type of aircraft. Southwest Airlines, known for its low-cost model and punctuality, had been operating for over 30 years without any fatal accident. With a corporate culture focused on pilot autonomy, the company trusted its crews to make responsible operational decisions without pressure to complete flights in unsafe conditions, just like today's flight. At the controls of the 737 was Captain Bruce Sutherland, 59, with over 15,000 flight hours. He had served as an Air Force pilot for 26 years before joining Southwest, and had more than 4,500 hours on the 737. Beside him was First Officer Stephen Oliver, 34, with about 8,500 flight hours, 2,000 of them on the 737. He had previously been a captain at Mesaba Airlines. Both pilots were well-rested and in good physical condition. On board were 103 people, 98 passengers and 5 crew members, 2 pilots and 3 cabin crew. At 5:58 p.m., with over a 2-hour delay, Flight 1248 began its takeoff roll. They lifted off without incident and headed toward Chicago. During climb and cruise, the cockpit is calm. Both pilots thoroughly review the weather reports. The snowstorm over Chicago is worsening. Minutes later, they receive the 3rd revision of the flight plan, which changes the runway and braking conditions. The landing is shifted from runway 4R to 31C, with braking reports indicating good in the first third, poor in the second. Winds are from 090 degrees at 11 knots, which means that if they land on runway 31C, they'll have a tailwind component. After beginning their approach to Chicago at around 10,000 feet, air traffic control instructs them to enter a holding pattern due to runway clearing operations. The first officer uses the time to input data into the onboard performance computer OPC. He tests different scenarios. With acceptable braking, the stopping distance would leave a margin of 600 feet. With poor braking, that margin would drop to just 40 feet. Still, the system doesn't prohibit them from continuing. The OPC doesn't show warnings because the entered wind doesn't exceed the operational limit of 10 knots. But there's a problem. The OPC assumes the thrust reversers are deployed immediately, which no one mentions in the cockpit. The pilots discuss their options. If conditions worsen, they can divert to St. Louis or Kansas City. But conditions aren't entirely unacceptable, and other aircraft have managed to land, so they decide to proceed. At 7:03 p.m., Chicago local time, they're cleared to intercept the localizer for runway 31C. Visibility is reduced but acceptable. The runway visual range is 4,500 feet, above the 3,000 feet minimum required for landing. The controller informs them, braking action good in the first half, poor in the second half. The captain responds firmly, "We're going in." At 7:14 p.m., the aircraft touches down firmly on the runway. The impact is hard, the spoilers deploy, the auto brakes activate, but something goes wrong. The thrust reversers don't engage. The captain tries to deploy them but can't fully move the levers. Believing the automatic system is working correctly, he doesn't persist. The aircraft begins to slow down, but braking is poor. The runway is covered with a layer of compacted snow that limits traction. Deceleration drops sharply halfway down the runway. The first officer shouts in distress, "Brakes! Brakes!" The captain reacts by manually applying the brakes, but he still doesn't touch the thrust reversers. The first officer then looks toward the pedestal and realizes the levers are still stowed. Without hesitation, he pushes the captain's hand aside, grabs the reverse thrust levers, and deploys them to full power. The time elapsed, 18 seconds since touchdown. Too late. There are less than 1,000 feet of runway remaining. The aircraft skids across the snow, overruns the safety area, plows through a metal fence, destroys an ILS antenna, and jumps over the airport perimeter road. It doesn't stop. At the intersection of 55th Street and Central Avenue, a family car is cautiously making its way along the snow-covered road. The 737 slams into it broadside. The fuselage and wing crush it against another vehicle. Inside, 6-year-old Joshua Woods dies instantly. His parents and siblings are severely injured. The aircraft comes to rest across the road. Once the plane stopped, the silence in the cockpit was immediately broken by the voices of the flight attendants, who began the evacuation quickly and orderly. The first officer, following procedure, carried out the emergency checklist while the captain went into the passenger cabin to assist the flight attendants. The front left and rear right doors were opened. The evacuation took place directly onto the pavement of Central Avenue, as the aircraft had breached the airport fence and was partially in a public area. First to arrive were units from the Chicago Fire Department and airport police. They faced a complex scene. A passenger jet stretched across an urban intersection, with vehicles crushed beneath the wing and fuel spilled on the snow. 6-year-old Joshua Woods was found lifeless in the back seat of the family car. His severely injured parents and siblings were extracted by firefighters using hydraulic tools. Two other vehicles were also involved in the impact. One was unoccupied. In the other, 4 people were injured. 18 passengers from the aircraft reported minor injuries from bruises, slips during evacuation, or the impact itself. They were transported to hospitals for evaluation. For the next 2 days, the aircraft remained stationary at the intersection. The landing gear had to be partially dismantled and the nose lifted onto a platform. On December 10th, it was towed back to the airport for final inspection. The emergency response was swift and efficient, and is credited with helping prevent an even more tragic outcome. What had happened? Why didn't the thrust reversers deploy at the start of braking? The accident investigation was led by the NTSB, which deployed a full team to Midway. From the outset, attention focused on three key areas: weather conditions, crew decisions, and the use of automated systems. The first finding: the thrust reversers were activated 18 seconds after touchdown. The FDR was clear. There was no mechanical failure. The system was functioning perfectly. The delay was entirely human. The captain had attempted to deploy them immediately after touchdown, but didn't manage to move the levers completely. He never tried again. Why didn't he insist? That's where the second finding comes in: distraction caused by the autobrake system, which both pilots were using for the first time in actual operation. The captain focused on the automatic deceleration and failed to manually verify the reversers. Meanwhile, the aircraft was slowing at an inadequate rate. The first officer did react, but too late. It wasn't until he shouted "brakes" and looked down at the pedestal that he noticed the reversers were still stowed. By the time he deployed them, the aircraft was already beyond normal braking limits. The OPC software was also heavily criticized. Although it allowed for brake margin calculations, it didn't make clear that it assumed reversers were deployed and that wind limits were automatically set to the maximum allowable, without a clear visual warning. Another key factor was insufficient pilot training on mixed braking conditions. Southwest had a clear policy. When runway braking reports included both good and poor, the most restrictive should be used. But that rule wasn't included in the manuals or part of recurrent training. Both pilots were unaware of it. The decision not to divert the flight was also reviewed. Although they had enough fuel to reach Kansas City or St. Louis, the pilots felt confident in the OPC data. There was no external pressure, but there was operational momentum. Other aircraft had landed successfully shortly before, under similar conditions. Finally, a major infrastructure deficiency was identified. Midway's runway 31C lacked an EMAS and didn't have the 1,000-foot runway safety area recommended by the FAA. They were only about 82 feet beyond the runway end. In later simulations, the NTSB determined that if a 230-foot EMAS had been in place, the aircraft would have stopped within airport boundaries. The final report attributed the probable cause to the failure to deploy thrust reversers in a timely manner, with multiple contributing factors: inadequate training, ambiguities in performance software, unclear operational policies, and airport infrastructure deficiencies. This was the first fatal accident in Southwest's history. The airline revised its training policies, updated the OPC to display clearer warnings, and improved its winter operations training. Chicago Midway, in turn, began work to install EMAS at runway ends, something previously ruled out due to space limitations. The accident had a significant media and regulatory impact. The FAA created the TALPA ARC group, which reformed procedures for evaluating contaminated runways. Starting in 2016, a new numerical runway condition coding system, Runway Condition Codes, was introduced. The death of Joshua Woods shocked the public. In his honor, road safety campaigns were launched, and the installation of runway overrun areas in urban airports was accelerated. The 737 was repaired, repainted, and re-registered as N286WN. It returned to active service less than a year later. Today, it continues to operate in Southwest's fleet, having become a symbol of resilience after one of the airline's darkest days. As for Joshua Woods and his family, they were driving to visit his grandparents. The family filed a lawsuit against Southwest and Boeing. In 2007, a confidential settlement was reached, closing the case without a public trial. Thank you for joining me on this journey back to December 8th, 2005. A day when snow and human error combined in a preventable tragedy. Flight 1248 reminds us that even when everything seems under control, a single oversight can be the difference between safety and disaster.